If you're ever asked to moderate an expert panel or host a roundtable conversation at some event, do you know what makes a great session where people are engaged and actively participating and not just bored and hiding behind their smartphones? Turns out there are 10 key things that you as the moderator will want to do to make sure that the attendees love the event and the experts who took time out of their day to share their thoughts actually feel honored and they're grateful that they agreed to speak. And in this video, I'm going to share with you the 5 most important out of the 10, and then at the end of this short video, I'm going to share with you where you can go to get the other 5 if you want to go a little bit deeper. But before I share with you those tips, here's a personal panelist nightmare I experienced in July of this year when I was at an innovation conference. I attended a panel with 3 experts. They were being moderated by a facilitator, and I couldn't have been more excited to listen to the author of a book that I'd already read his book, and even though I didn't know the other 2 experts, their presence with the author still gave them the authority and credibility in my eyes. So I was stoked. I broke out my iPad with my Apple Pencil, opened up a new blank document for notes, and I was all ready to be inspired. The moderator started off with some brief introductions and then launched into the first question. Now, I should probably pause at this point to let you know this was only a 1-hour panel discussion. So with 3 people on the stage, the moderator would need to evenly split the 60 minutes into 20 minutes apiece, and then knowing that these things usually start a few minutes late, by the time he welcomed the attendees and did the introductions and allowing for closing thoughts by the moderator, it's probably really more about like 15 minutes per speaker. Now, why have I turned this into a mathematics story problem? Well, because if you're ever moderating an event, you need to know the breakdown. If you don't, before you know it, time's going to escape you, and you'll hit the end of your panel with some of the panelists sitting there never speaking a word. So that's the first tip. Do the math. Be aware of just how many minutes each panelist should get before you even begin. All right, now back to the story. Okay, so how did this panel discussion go? Well, the first person, not the one I came to see, by the way, spoke for nearly 20 minutes on the first question. That was about 18 minutes, maybe 19 minutes too long. But the moderator did nothing to move them along. Then, after he finished speaking, the moderator asked him a follow-up question, and again the diatribe continued. And before we knew it, we were halfway through the session, and 2 of the speakers hadn't said anything other than how happy they were to be a part of something so cool. This leads me to the second tip. Interrupt your guests. I mean, not for the sake of just butting in, but you absolutely are in charge of the panel, so act like it. If a panelist is going long, it's not just your right to interrupt them, it's your job to interrupt them. You absolutely must take control and move that conversation along. So how do you interrupt? You just do it. I mean, there's never a great time to butt in, so just butt in. A comment like, "Hey Mark, I'm fascinated by the story and I want to make sure that I have time for everybody to be able to share. Can you kind of button this up into a key point so we can get to the other panelists?" There, that's it. Now you might think that by just letting someone talk all they want won't reflect poorly on you, just them. And you would be wrong. At the end, the participants might make comments and even joke about the long-winded panelist, but they're going to be angry at you for letting it happen. Or maybe even worse, they might just lose respect for you. You're the moderator, so moderate. Now remember how the moderator asked a follow-up question after that long-winded kickoff? That was actually a great technique, but it was poorly executed. Follow-up questions are great, but bounce-off questions are even better. What's a bounce-off question? It's anything that you can pull from the last answer that you can use to bounce off the current speaker onto the next one. So tip number 3, ask bounce-off questions. It might sound something like this. Hey Tom, I loved the part about how the alligator in your backyard kept you from enjoying your barbecue, which leads me to my next question for Sally. Sally, how did you recover when your best intended plans got derailed? Right? So by bouncing off the previous person's answer, it does a few things. Number 1, it lets the person who just finished speaking know that their time is done, right? And secondly, it shows that the person and the audience that you were paying attention. Oh, and here's tip number 4. Pay attention to what they're saying. One of the worst things I think personally that you could do as a moderator is have a list of predetermined questions that you ask your panelists regardless of what they said in the previous answer. When you just go down like a list of questions, you're going to inevitably trip up and ask something that the panelists have already answered in one of their previous stories. But if you can listen intently, if you can create an entire panelist discussion bouncing off of one question and on to the next the entire time, oh, that's beautiful. Besides, by the way, pre-written questions, especially when you've already provided the questions to the panelists so they know what you're going to ask them, it just ends up sounding scripted and poorly rehearsed. But it's rarely a good look. Okay, now we've talked about the importance of butting in on a talkaholic, but what if you get somebody on the panel who's just the opposite? What if you get somebody who their nerves have got the best of them and they can't remember what they wanted to say? Well, as the moderator, it's your job to put them at ease and throw them a lifeline. How do you do that? You change the question or you move on to another panelist. So, for example, if Frank is struggling to answer what's the most important aspect of their job, change the question to something easier. Now, by the way, as an aside, as a general rule, avoid asking extreme questions like what's the best something or what's the worst something or what's the number one thing of anything. And if you want to know why, check out my other video called Questions to Avoid When Interviewing Guests. I'll leave a link for you at the end of this video. All right, now back to the technique. Ask easier questions. Poor Frank, in our hypothetical situation here, he's struggling to answer what the most important aspect of his job is. There's an awkward silence in the room. And the longer that silence goes, the more pressure poor Frank is going to experience. Just adding to the silence makes it even worse. So throw the poor man a lifeline. Ask an easier question, like loosen up the qualification of most important, or drill down into something specific. It might sound something like this. Actually, Frank, here's an even better question. Of all the important things you have to do in your job, what is just, say, one or maybe two things that people would want to know in order to succeed like you have? You see, by rephrasing to just one or two things, it takes the pressure off Frank to come up with the most important thing. Chances are he already had thought of maybe 3 or 4 things, but because he couldn't select which one was the most important, by giving him this out to just mention anything, he'll break his silence and he'll start talking. By the way, and if he's still struggling, well, give him time to think without the awkward silence. Just move on to somebody else and say, hey, Frank, I'm going to let you think about that answer, and I'm going to move on to Sally, but I'll come back to you later after she shares. And then the moment Sally starts talking, by the way, poor Frank is going to think of a million different things to say. So just go back up to him when Sally wraps up. All right, I hope you've received value with these first 5 tips. And if you want to take a deeper dive and you want to find out why you should never ask your guests on stage to share their contact details, or what kind of a conversation you need to have with your panelists before the program even begins, and how to make sure that your audience has questions for the panelists, so they don't just stare blankly at you when you ask them if they have any questions. And I've also got, by the way, 2 other key points to make your panel facilitation a great success. And I've got a written summary of all the tips that I've already shared with you. Just email me at topher@tophermorrison.com with the title 10 Moderator Tips in the subject line, and I'll send you the PDF as soon as I read your email. And remember, let's all try a little harder to be a little better.